we now have the interview that we have been talking about all morning. Incredibly excited to have former Secretary of State, former CIA Director, former Congressman Michael R. Pompeo, and of course, my former boss on the line with us. Good morning, sir.
Morgan, it's great to be back with you, and congratulations on your show. And it's on the right channel, the Patriot channel. You are, in fact, that.
Thank you, sir. Well, we have been talking all morning long. We actually had our colleague and another former advisor of yours, Miles Yu, with an interview earlier talking about China. We've been talking about Israel. We've been talking about China. And one of the things I noticed, too, is that you just published an op-ed a few weeks ago about how our global adversaries under the Biden administration have aligned with a common goal of strategic convergence to weaken America. How do you think that we got to the point where you were a part of the Abraham Accords, peace in the Middle East, taking out Qasem Soleimani, the world's largest terrorist? How do we get from that to the point that our adversaries have lined up to take us down?
Well, Morgan, if there's one thing that those of us who have been practitioners, that is, not academics, not people who write long pieces. We need those folks too. But those who are practitioners understand and appreciate is that deterrence is always temporary. That is, it is your adversary's perception of risk that drives their behavior. And I think frankly, decades of these folks, these leaders in China, the leaders in Russia, knowing Joe Biden, they'd seen him on Codell's, right? They knew this guy, a progressive left base that is deeply isolationist and who believes that America is the problem, not the solution. And then you combine that with current day activities, right? Talking about the failure in Afghanistan or the president's statement that said, well, a minor incursion to Ukraine might be okay, delisting the Houthis as terrorists. These are all elements, signals, symptoms of creating space and opportunity for the worst tyrants in the world to try to join together to undermine America and our republic. I think we're seeing the manifestation of that, and there's only one way to get it back, Morgan. It is to demonstrate American resolve, to allow our partners and our allies to win, not just to compete. And this administration has not shown a willingness to actually allow that to happen, and that's dangerous for the United States of America.
You know, speaking of the Houthis, sir, I know that we spent in the Trump administration quite a bit of time getting together the designation package and all the legal things required to designate the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. And we saw within just weeks of the Biden administration taking over, they withdrew that designation from the Houthis. Now, for those of you who are driving around, you're wrapping Christmas presents maybe today, grocery shopping, and you're thinking, well, what are the Houthis? That is yet another terrorist group in the Middle East that is funded, paid for, trained, equipped by the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so what was it like for you, Mr. Secretary, to see the Biden team just get rid of that designation? They got nothing for it, by the way, that I'm aware of. No negotiation. The Houthis didn't promise to stop committing acts of terrorism. They're clearly still doing it. So should they put that designation back? And what else should the United States be doing? What about military options to stop the Houthis from attacking our ships?
Morgan, I remember being with you so many mornings as we were preparing for the day. Are they terrorists? Yeah, they're terrorists. What's a terrorist? Yeah, yes, they should designate them a terrorist, and we should do the legal work, and we should get that all right. But at the end of the day, we should speak the truth. We shouldn't live in a fantasy land as a national security matter. And it is fantasy to pull the Houthis from a terrorist list. I think the Biden team did it because they had some larger theory of Iranian balancing the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And if you're wrapping gifts today, you're thinking, what the heck? The truth is, the reality is that you've got sailors today traveling through the Bab el-Mandeb, traveling in the Persian Gulf. You've got Marines in Djibouti. You've got all kinds of American assets that are at risk. And not only them, but our friends, Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates and Mohammed bin Salman in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who are getting attacked by the Houthis every day. We should not only redesignate them as terrorists as a matter of common sense, but you have to go to the source of the problem, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and impose real costs on them to convince them to turn off what could be the closure of the entire Red Sea to commercial traffic. If you can't get that through the head, the very presidents that we're all wrapping today have crude oil, petroleum products that flowed through that strait and made their way to our kitchen table and under our tree. We ought to get this right. It's not hard to deter them. It just takes American resolve and leadership.
That's right, sir. And one of the things that we are seeing, and I was just mentioning this to former Congressman Mike Rogers, who is running for the Senate in Michigan. We were just talking about this, and you've gone after the education system in the United States, especially the head of the unions. One of the things that we were just talking about as it relates to the ongoing turmoil that we're seeing in the Middle East is the number of young Americans. And this new Harvard-Harris poll, I bring it up again to you as well, sir, because it was shocking to me. 53%, these are all 18 to 24. 53% of them, these are Americans, believe that calls to the genocide of Jews should be allowed. 67% think that Jews are oppressors and should be treated as such. And a whopping 31% of young Americans polled don't even believe that Israel has the right to exist. What do we do, Mr. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo? What do we do about our young people just believing this garbage? Let's call it what it is, total garbage.
Total garbage. Look, I heard you with Congressman Rogers. He is a friend and was a former colleague on the House Intelligence Committee. He sees the world the right way. Look, as for the next generation, I think this anti-Semitism, this anti-Zionism, right, the failure of them to understand Israel's basic right to exist, evinces an even larger problem. It is that we have, in fact, polluted the education of the next generation. And I talk about this with some frequency. I was the 70th Secretary of State. Secretary Blinken is the 71st Secretary of State. The 78th Secretary of State won't have a prayer if we fail to teach the next generation about the things that are true and basic and decent, our history, our Judeo-Christian traditions, and who are friends and allies around the world. If we pollute them with the 1619 Project and this vision of an oppressor and oppressed classes as the central theme of the human condition, instead of individual liberty and freedom, you'll get exactly these kind of poll results, and the world will be less safe, and our children and grandchildren, Morgan, will live in an America that is deeply different. We have to take this back. We have to take these educational ideas back to our founding principles to retie them to our history. If not, you'll see just this same data set. It breaks my heart to see that 50% of American young people don't think Israel ought to have the right to exist. I think there's a disconnection from faith, not just my faith, Christian faith, but from all the Abrahamic faith that underlays that as well. I hope our church leaders, our leaders in synagogues across America, will do a better job with this next generation of reminding them about these biblical truths.
Yeah, thank you again. This is former Secretary of State, former CIA Director Mike Pompeo on the Morgan Ortagus Show. One of the things that our listeners may not know about you is how many times we went to Israel when you were Secretary of State and the close working relationship that you had with them. And I bring that up, number one, because we'd always love for you to share any stories that are, of course, in your book as well, if people haven't read that yet. But also, I think it's important to remember is that we keep calling Republican administration, Democratic administrations before President Trump did this. We keep calling on the state of Israel to give up, to give more, to concede. And we were the first administration, especially under U.S. Secretary of State, that said, no, we're going to empower the state of Israel. We're not going to force them to give things up. In fact, we're putting our embassy in Jerusalem and let the chips fall where they may.
We did, and we were right. And we created better living conditions for everyone in the entire region and reduced the risk that we'd have to send naval reservists like you or someone working for Space Command to that region and someday risk their lives. We created more peace as well. We did it, Morgan, with the central understanding that this isn't about punishing the Palestinians or making their life worse. Indeed, we want them to live better in Judea and Samaria than they have under the authoritarian terrorism of Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority. We don't want them to live that way. We don't want them to have to live under the jackboot of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And we knew that the way to do that was to empower Israel to provide security and sovereignty for itself, for them to build out peaceful relationships, diplomatic relationships, commercial relationships, military relationships with our allies and friends in the Middle East. And when you do those things, everyone's life will be better. And the risk of terror that we saw on October 7th, the barbaric acts of that day, are less likely to happen. I get asked, Morgan, I'm sure you do too, would this have happened if President Trump and you and
All
I
the
were
time.
still there? I have a theory, but I don't ever answer the thing I'd like to say. But here's what I can say with absolute certainty. It didn't happen on our watch, Morgan.
Right.
And I think there was a reason for that. I deeply believe that there was a reason, because America was respected. They knew of our abiding kinship for the people of Israel. We were going to be lockstep with them. And the Gulf Arab state leaders knew that we were friends and partners as well, and we would support them no matter their challenges. When you undermine that, as President Biden did, you create the context, the backdrop against which these barbarians, these guys who call themselves Hamas, can act with Iran's support.
And that's really, when we talk about the head of the snake, when you talk about all of the problems that we're experiencing in the Middle East, it all stems from the Islamic Republic of Iran. And you very famously, in the Trump administration, we withdrew from the JCPOA, which is, of course, the very failed and flawed Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration put into place to try and get them not to have a nuclear weapon. But it was flawed. We knew it didn't cover things like support for terrorism that we see today, support for ballistic missiles. Can you just, former Secretary of State and former CIA Director Mike Pompeo, can you explain to our audience our approach to Iran? And now, we spent 3 years, or we as in the Biden administration have spent 3 years sort of chasing them, begging them to get into a deal that they're clearly not getting back into. What can the Biden team do in 2024 with a year left in their presidency to pivot away from their failed Iran policies?
Well, there's a handful of things they could do. I don't expect they'll do them. It would be an admission of failure of staggering proportions. But we had it right, and it stems from this central idea that the leadership in Iran, President Raisi, the butcher of Tehran, the Ayatollah himself, the leadership in Iran is evil. If you accept that, and that you can't negotiate with evil and the world's largest state sponsor of terror, that what you have to try to do is deny them the capacity to inflict that terror. And that was our aim. So we got out of the deal, which gave them tons of money with which to build their terror forces and their nuclear program. And we applied sanctions. We called it the maximum pressure campaign. It was the building out of a coalition that denied Iran the ability to conduct trade and create wealth that would go to their terror force, the external terror force, what's called the IRGC, and to the Ayatollah himself. Those were the central hallmarks. This administration could do the same. We were very effective at that. We had almost strangled their economy, but within a couple of weeks, it was very clear the sanctions were going to stop being enforced, and now the administration's given them billions and billions of dollars. And I'll give you one other just very tangible impact. So the United States paid about $6 billion in ransom to get back half a dozen Americans. This is a noble objective. But think about this. More Americans are held today after the paying of that ransom than they were before that. Right. Now there's some 10 Americans being held by the Iranians in the Gaza Strip after we paid $6 billion to get our own hostages home. This is a failed set of policies. We know the right way to impose costs on Iran and begin to deter their evil, not only in Gaza and in Israel, but their evil all across the world, including the provision of drones to the Russians to kill Ukrainian kids. Our American policy today is just fundamentally 180 degrees messed up. We know how to get it back, Morgan.
That's right. And so we appreciate, of course, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on the line. It was an incredibly different time when you had President Trump and Mike Pompeo in charge. I do also get that same question of what would you have done? And it's hard to answer how we would handle a situation that just never happened under us. And I think that we put the right mechanisms in place. So when the first time I got the question, you'll probably remember this, we had just left the Trump administration. We were early days into the Biden administration, and Secretary of State Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan went to Alaska to meet with their Chinese counterparts, and their Chinese counterparts surprised them and sort of berated them for 20 minutes in front of the press. For me, that was the canary in the coal mine for everything that would end up happening around the world, unfortunately, to President Biden's national security team.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Morgan, this next year could be very dangerous for the exact reason you described. Deterrence evaporates over time and with consistent failure to reinforce that deterrence. And we're now 3 years into that failure. I'm worried about what will happen as we move into this election year, not only whether it's in Taiwan or the South China Sea or the Strait of Hormuz or the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, these choke points, but I'm also worried about the fact we have a southern border wide open and an administration totally refusing to even acknowledge that we have a problem with millions of people streaming across our country. Our adversaries know this too, Morgan. We could have a really bad day here in America.
That's right. Well, I am just so lucky and so blessed. You gave me my dream job, so I will forever be grateful to be the spokesperson under former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, also former CIA director, former congressman, and really important former businessman from Kansas, which I think is probably the thing that you're most proud of. Sir, I hope you'll come back with us in the new year and talk more about the world.
I absolutely will. I didn't give you the gig, Morgan. You earned it. Bless you. Have a wonderful rest of this year, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone listening.